Hello guys, welcome back. It's Mrs. Bobman. Today we're going to talk about Hammurabi, specifically his laws, known as the Code of Hammurabi, as we continue to talk about some of these early ancient civilizations. So we've talked about what the four early civilizations are: Mesopotamia, India, China, and Egypt. And Hammurabi ruled over large part of Mesopotamia once it becomes an empire, and his law code is important for several reasons. But before we look at him specifically, Mesopotamia, the area that Hammurabi rules, is what we in modern times refer to as Iraq, so that part of the world, and it is again one of the oldest civilizations in our history. As the civilization in Mesopotamia continues to grow, city-states are formed, more city-states are formed, and as these territories sort of combine and expand, they form empires. And so we see not only several leaders, rulers popping up throughout time, but also the conflicts, right? The desire for leaders to have more land, more territory, more resources. And the land within Mesopotamia, because of its geographical aspects, is very vulnerable to invasion. And so the leaders of Mesopotamia do work to protect their people and to maintain order and to protect their borders. So Hammurabi comes into power in Mesopotamia at about 1792 BC. By the way, so BC is a term that we see often. It refers to the time before the birth of Christ, with the term AD referring to basically starting at that year zero and moving forward, and those are to help us designate between the two eras. Those terms were created about 500 years ago, and historians and many scholars today feel like those terms are a bit out of date. They're still used, you may still see them, but you may also see the more modern terms BCE, which means before the Common Era, and then CE, which refers to Common Era. So they refer to the same amount of time, the same time period. Before Common Era is the time before the birth of Christ, when those years are building up to, what we would consider then year one. And then AD and CE, Common Era, are the time following that. So those terms, if you read one, it's good to know what it refers to, and then if you see the other version, know what you can compare it to. The terms BC and AD have a lot of religious connotation, and so by updating the terms, it gives us a little more of a secular verbiage for it. So anyway, back to Hammurabi. Hammurabi, by 1792, becomes the leader of Mesopotamia. He has control over the empire. And he does do a lot, again, as I said, to protect his people, to try to maintain the land and the empire, and to try to help them continue to grow as an empire. Hammurabi, one of the things he's known for is having a very well-trained army, a very well-disciplined army, which is of course important when you are trying to protect your borders and your people. He's able to use his army to divide and conquer different regions, and that's how he's able also to gain his power. Hammurabi is very confident, like a lot of the leaders we'll learn about in history, and he would often refer to himself as the son of Babylon, but not like the S-O-N, son, like the S-U-N, son of Babylon. So that gives us kind of an idea of how he took his role and what he thought of himself as being the son of Babylon. So again, he's known as a great warrior. He does, once he gains power, he does a lot to build. He does a lot of building. He builds temples. He builds defensive structures. He builds irrigation canals. He does a lot, again, for the advancement of the people and the cities of Mesopotamia. He also encourages trade between the various city-states, which is really important for the economy and for the use of materials and accessing different resources. He's also probably most remembered, as I mentioned at the beginning, for his law code. His law code we refer to as the Code of Hammurabi. It's very famous, and it's important because Hammurabi is the first one that comes up with this idea that seems so simple to us now, but this idea that he has a set guideline for rules, and everybody knows them, and they're actually posted somewhere. In his case, they're engraved in columns and they're very elaborate, but they're in a place for people to see, that can't necessarily be changed, right? There's a crime, there's a punishment. Crime, punishment. And he writes them down. And they're set, literally in stone in some cases, for people to know, if I take this action, this will be my consequence. And Hammurabi is the first one to do this. He does this as a way to try to maintain order within his empire. He wants people to understand essentially his expectations. Again, if you do this, this is what will happen. Now, looking back at Hammurabi's code, there are a lot of things that by today's standards are totally unacceptable, and it falls short in a lot of places. But again, just the fact that it was something that could be accessed by the public, it wasn't that at any given moment at the whim of Hammurabi he would make up whatever kind of mood he was in that day, he would make up your punishment, right? It was established, and it was very clear, and it was enforced. And so he's the first one that does that. Within Hammurabi's code, there is no account for motive. It doesn't matter what your intent was. It matters what the action was. So again, you can decide for yourself whether or not you think that's fair, but it's interesting to look at that in Hammurabi's code, that, there weren't differentiations based on, was it something that was an accident or something that was intentional or planned. It really just comes down to the crime and then the punishment. Hammurabi's code is made up of 282 different laws. And it's interesting to look at his laws, again, for a lot of reasons, but to see what sort of values he and his society, influenced by him, of course, but he and his people found to be important. When a civilization creates rules and creates laws, they are basing them on their moral code, often on their spiritual beliefs, which are influential, and the things that are important to them. So we can look at Hammurabi's code and see some really interesting features. A lot of his codes have to do with family, things like arranged marriages and who is in charge of the children legally. There's a lot to do, laws regarding husbands and wives and what each party is allowed to do. And so we can see, again, those things that are a focus within their community. Now, something that is lacking, or a negative thing that we can see within Hammurabi's code, is that it's very much dependent upon your class, your social standing. So even though, again, he lays out the crime and the punishment, it might be very different depending on your social class. The punishment might vary. So for example, if a man is accused of murdering a pregnant woman, which is a crime, of course, right? If the woman is a slave, the man has to pay a fine. If the woman was a free woman, not a slave, then the man is subject to the death penalty. So same crime, but different punishment depending on the class of the victim. It also lacks inequality between men and women. So there were many, many examples in Hammurabi's code of crimes that if they were committed by a man would have one punishment, and if they're committed by a woman would have an entirely different punishment. So for example, if a man is accused of adultery, of cheating on his wife, there might be a fine assigned to that crime. If a woman is accused of the same thing, her punishment is to be bound together, right? Have her hands tied together and tossed into the Euphrates River to drown. So not a lot of social equality, and unfortunately that's not unusual for this time, but again, it's very interesting for us to look and observe and see how he organized this based on their society. So some other things, because of the patriarchal rule, a woman didn't really have any control over her own children. A man did. A woman could not file for divorce, but a man could. And so a lot of discrepancies there. There are some really interesting laws, things that have to do, for example, with construction. If you build someone's house and the house collapses and somebody is injured, your punishment would be the same injury. If somebody is unfortunately killed if a house collapses, the builder could be subject to death based on the punishment and the crime. A really famous phrase that we still hear today that comes out of Hammurabi's code is an eye for an eye. And that's very much the basis for his laws. It is retaliatory justice, right? As in, you are getting the punishment that fits the crime. By the way, Gandhi later said an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. I think that's probably a better lesson for us, but we'll get to Gandhi later. But again, coming back to the significance of Hammurabi, to write down his code is a huge step in organizing societies, in organizing governments, and in moving forward in what we would consider moving more towards the modern world, modern society, as far as the way that societies are structured, and how people are expected to interact within their government. I should point out Hammurabi, feel like I've given him a hard time. He does have some parts of his code that we can look at and consider actually very advanced for his day. His code does include the theory of innocent until proven guilty and trial by jury. And so those are some very advanced judicial concepts that in many places don't come for a very long time. But Hammurabi does have that. Again, it's coupled with some other things that are not equal, but those are some very enlightened concepts. So when we look at Hammurabi's code and understand the significance of why it's important that he did this and why it's important in history, think about, in general, why laws exist, why rules exist, where do the ideas come from, and what can we learn from them? So we've talked about Hammurabi, but throughout history we can look at other examples of leaders and their rules, or governments and their rules, and we can learn a lot about a society based on what sort of rules they have. And Hammurabi's code is a great example of that. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next time.